Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, this week I'm speaking with a man who's been a big influence on my career, actually probably unbeknown to him. He's a gentleman called Paul Z. Jackson, and before I get him to introduce himself, I'm just going to give you a bit of background as to why I've got Paul on the Sports Psych Show. So, back in around 2005, I did a course in a framework called Solution-Focused Brief Therapy. And Solution-Focused Brief Therapy, or SFBT for short, is a goal-directed collaborative approach to change. And I did this course with a couple of coaches, and one of which was Paul, and it gave me such brilliant tools. I use these tools every single day in my practice, and I am constantly talking to coaches about the value of these tools. So I'm really excited to have Paul on. I've been wanting to get him on for some time, and as he'll probably describe, I don't think he does that much in sport, but everything he does is frighteningly applicable to sport and to sports coaching. So without further ado, Paul Z. Jackson, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks, Dan. Pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. And as I said earlier, I don't think you're doing much in sport, but I know you do a lot in the business world and with various communities globally. So what I'd love is if you can introduce yourself and just give us a broad background as to where you've been and what you've done and what you're doing now.
Okay, I'll do a very quick potted history. Mm-hmm. I started when I was a graduate as a journalist and worked in newspapers for 10 years. So a lot of asking people questions, articulating their replies and putting that out very quickly to the public. Then I joined the BBC and was a comedy producer, making comedies and quizzes for BBC Radio, network radio programmes. And after that, I spent a couple of years seeing if I could make a living producing improvised comedy theatre shows, and discovered that I couldn't. I was subsidising the arts. So I put together the various skills I'd acquired and started doing training and consultancy. And around about that time discovered solution-focused approach and made that a core part, central part of my work. So now my company is called The Solutions Focus. And as you say, we do consultancy, training, coaching, and development of the ideas as part of a worldwide community.
So, solution-focused brief therapy. I don't know if it changed my life. I think that would be a bit over the top. But it was just certainly such a powerful approach to change, helping people change or develop themselves. And as I mentioned in the introduction, I immediately started to implement so many or all of the tools that I learned on your course into my practice, and I use them to this day. So I guess a really good starting point here, Paul, is to give us a bit of background regarding solution-focused brief therapy. Where does it come from? Who originally devised it, and I suppose how did you start using it?
That's a great question, and you absolutely accurately describe it as an approach to change. And you've noticed one of the best things about it, that it's very practical and people can start using it straight away. So there's no great mysteries to it. It came out of a therapeutic background, particularly family therapy, and the people who developed it were in America, Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg. And they would take the toughest cases in therapy that nobody else would take and see what they could do with them. And they started getting very good results by working in this rather different and unusual but intellectually elegant way. So they had very good results, and they started to build a following and have conferences. And at the time that I mentioned when I went freelance after the BBC, I met up with Mark McCurgo, who had an interest in solution-focused brief therapy. His wife was also a counsellor using different approaches and was familiar with that world. And we started hanging out at solution-focused therapy conferences. Neither of us were therapists, nor wanted to be, but we loved the ideas. So we picked up this set of ideas, got to know them, and decided that we'd see if they could be used in organisations and in coaching particularly. Coaching being, of course, very close to therapy in its where it's set up. You often one-to-one or perhaps team coaching or a small group of people who you're working with. And we wrote a book called The Solutions Focus, and we retooled it. We gave some tools and concepts our own names so that they would live apart from the therapy world, but be distinctively usable in the world of coaching and teams and organisations. That book came out in 2001. We started having world conferences in 2002, which have been going every year since then. And a worldwide community of practitioners has built up around these concepts, with many other very good people contributing practical and intellectual development to the field.
To this day, I always remember, I think one of the first things that you and Mark, as you said, that Mark McCurgow talked about was the approach that Insu Kim Berg and Steve DeShazer took, derived in part from the notion that a problem isn't always a problem. I suppose what I'm about to say, I might not say it as eloquently as you, so perhaps you can fill in the gaps here, but when Steve DeShazer and Insu Kim Berg, say, worked with people suffering from depression, they would base their counselling on the notion that depressed people aren't always depressed, and they'd start to try to explore the areas when they're not depressed. An alcoholic wouldn't always crave a drink, and they'd start to explore the times when alcoholics don't want to drink. So they're sort of making that small picture and trying to expand that picture, if you like. Would that be? Have I articulated that well, or is there a bit more to it than that?
You've articulated it well, and there's a bit more to it. So yes, I think the problem is often experienced by people as a problem. They'll come and say they're depressed or they're alcoholic, or others will tell them that that's what's wrong with them. But that doesn't get you very far. Everyone can agree that it's a problem, it's not good, it's going to have bad effects. And the traditional thing to do with that would be to start to analyse it and explore the problem and wonder what's causing it and what it's doing to you and what impact it's having and what will happen if you keep going along that line. None of which does anything to advance what's wanted, which is something different from the problem, what we call the solution. And the solution doesn't mean what should we do next. It means how do we want life to be? What do we want in our life in relation to all aspects of life? So, as you say, Steve and Insu would ask, when doesn't the problem occur? When are you not drinking? What's different about that? And that can be taken even a step further to say we don't need to start even with a problem. We can just start by asking people what they want. Start painting a desired picture of when you're doing well, when you're at your best. What would that be like? And what resources do you have that can help you get towards that? And how will you know you're making progress so that we can look out for signs of things getting better and do more of those? So it's built around the idea of knowing what you want and doing more of what works and stop doing what doesn't work.
Knowing what you want and doing more of what works, I think really resonates with me in the world of sport, because as you can imagine, Paul, I have and have had quite a lot of athletes come to me and say, well, I'm not confident right now. And for those coaches listening in, I'm sure you've all experienced athletes coming to you, your footballers, your golfers, your cricketers, etc., coming to you and saying, well, I'm not confident right now, and coach, I'm lacking confidence, or I'm struggling to focus, or whatever it might be. And what I love about this solution-focused brief therapy approach is it starts from that philosophy of, well, the problem isn't always the problem. So there's a great in there, as you were describing, Paul, in terms of, well, let's expand on when times when there were times when you were confident. Let's talk about your best games, your best moments, the times when you've been man or woman of the match. And so it's a very, very practical start to a conversation, in my opinion. It's a really useful starting point.
Absolutely. So if someone comes along and says, I'm not confident, that's the critical moment, because you can explore not confident, which I would suggest is largely useless, but wastes an enormous amount of time in coaching, therapy, organisational talk, everywhere. Or you could say, okay, you're not confident. I'm guessing you want to be confident. And the person's going to say, oh yeah, that's it. Or they might say, oh, it's not so much I want to be confident, I want to be focused, or I want to get better results. So we find out what the person wants, and that's often reached by a very simple coaching question, which is, you don't want that, this bad thing you've described that's afflicting you now. What do you want instead? So we're not dismissing that they are feeling that, or belittling it, or neglecting it in any way. But in our conversation with them, and coaching is largely conversational, we're going to overlook that, the problem and its causes, in favour of what they want. And our first job is to establish, what do they want? And then if they want to be confident, as you say, we can ask for examples of when they've been confident. What does confident look like for them? Because we don't necessarily know what they mean by confident, but they do. So if they can tell us by way of example, we're getting a really much more detailed picture of the way that person does confidence. And then they can do a bit more of being confident.
So knowing what somebody wants is what you call the platform.
That's right.
And I love that idea again about exploring what confidence looks like to them, because it's such a personal, subjective thing, isn't it? And so much in sport, like the business people that you'd work with in the world of organisations, corporate sector, public sector, their own personal challenges are very subjective to them. And so having the questioning tools to be able to help them explore their own subjective world. Well, what does confidence look like to you? What does it feel like when others are watching you and you're playing with confidence, or you're conducting a meeting with confidence, or you're communicating with confidence? That's such a empowering tool to have as a coach, whether it's in the world of sport or the business world, because you can help that client, that person, explore something in their subjective being, right?
Spot on. And the difficulty for coaches is resisting the temptation to dive into what's the cause of the problem. How come you're not confident?
Yeah.
These seem like such natural questions, but they're what we call problem talk questions, and they invite problem talk, and they don't get us anywhere towards progress. That's the radical difference of solution-focused approach. Can I tell you a sports story?
Yeah, please do, yes.
Right. So as you say, I don't do a lot of work in sports professionally, but I'm passionate about sports. I run, play tennis. I used to play a lot of squash and football, and I support football team and watch it.
You support Reading, don't you?
No,
I thought you were a Reading supporter. Who do you support?
Watford.
That's right. Sorry, I knew it was around the London area.
Somewhere around
Watford, doing well. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Well. I was once invited to coach a Swedish ice hockey team.
Okay.
I was visiting Sweden for a solution-focused training, and one of the participants was the coach. So I was guest coach of a Swedish ice hockey team, and I was at some disadvantages in that I spoke no Swedish, and they didn't speak a great deal of English,
right.
And I knew nothing about ice hockey. It turns out it's a game of three halves. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. Please enlighten me.
Game of three halves. They have two breaks. And I said to the team, well, I'm really honoured to be your guest coach this week. I don't know anything about ice hockey. Suppose you were playing well as a team. What should I look out for while you're playing that I could notice that would tell me that you were playing well? And they said, we'd be passing the puck around quickly. We'd be shouting out each other's names. We'd be staying close to each other. And they listed a dozen, 20 things that would indicate good play.
Yeah.
I said, that's really interesting. I'll watch out for those then, and we'll talk about it in the interval. And they went out and were alerted in their own minds to doing those things and played really well and were surprised at how good their performance was based on just a few questions from a coach who knew absolutely nothing about their sport.
Well, absolutely, Paul. It's such a powerful question to ask. And as you say, you don't need to be an expert in that sporting landscape. And it's not dissimilar to myself, is whilst I might have a great deal of knowledge of certain sports and specific sporting environments and have a number of tools and techniques that I can give to players, for me there's nothing more powerful than asking the question of the athlete or athletes, what does good look like? What does it feel like? Because they're in the number one, they're in the driving seat, they're in row A, basically. They're positioned perfectly to be able to come up with their own ideal solutions and performance states and performance habits and patterns and behaviours, because it's them, it's happening to them, it's what they do. And going back, it's a wonderful story that illuminates what we're talking about, and going back to this confidence piece, I think as coaches we're so quick to offer solutions. Well, you're not confident, try this, do that. Whereas for me, I think one of the most powerful things I learnt from the course 13, 14 years ago was this notion of, hey, stop, hold on, Dan. You're not in the brain and the nervous system of this player. You're not inside this player's world. It's a simple, elegant question that can help this player actually open up the answers for him or herself.
Yes, particularly important in sport, which is so much to do with the embodiment of skill. I'm a big fan of the inner game, the Tim Galway approach. And that's about getting people to experience flow and not get in the way of their own flow states. And you can't describe to someone what flow is like in terms of leg position, arm position, angle of racket, all the technical things that experts in the sport might know, and that might be useful at some point. But what you can do is invite people to pay attention to things that are going to help them because they're relevant to the activity, watching the ball on bounce hit, for example, in tennis. And people will then experience flow, and if you experience it and you've got a technique like that to get into it, you can do that more often.
Absolutely. Now, I want to start sort of emphasising some of the techniques that are inherent within the solution-focused brief therapy toolkit.
Sure.
And obviously we've talked about, sort of examining strengths and what does confidence look like, or what's it feel like when you play with focus and deal with distraction quickly, or any such scenarios that tend to come up in sport. But there's this wonderful tool that I started to use straight away after the course, which is called Future Perfect, which can really help enhance somebody's experience of brainstorming what they want. So just if you can, run us through this tool of Future Perfect.
Okay, so there are 6 tools, and we've talked about the platform, which is the brief description of what you want. And the Future Perfect is the expansion of that. If that's what you want, describe it in detail. And with sports, you can get people to embody it. So I'll ask people to explore in a variety of ways themselves at their very best, the best they could imagine themselves to be. So supposing you were playing to the fullest of your potential, how would you know? What signs would tell you? What would it be like in your body, in your muscles, in your breathing? What would people watching you notice about you that would tell you that you were at your very best rather than not very good or even almost at your best? What's the difference about you at your very best in observable, concrete detail and observable, concrete feelings, thoughts? So it's emotional, it's a cognitive and a descriptive picture. And you can spend a lot of time on that, particularly with teams. So we can do this as individuals, you at your best. Team at its best is a phenomenal exploration, a future perfect exploration, that I suspect is far too little done because it seems a bit airy-fairy. But if you get it in enough detail, then, as we're going to find out with the other tools, we can start exploring about when some or all of that starts happening and how is it that we do that.
Now, what I love about your description there is this notion of detail. I remember back in that original course, you talking about the importance of the question, what else?
Yes.
What else? What else?
That's
what
how
else?
To get detail.
Sorry?
That's how to get detail.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, again, this is so important to emphasise, is that I think as coaches, we possibly sometimes because of time constraints, but we can be fearful of pausing, waiting, silence, as players in sports sort of think about it, and you often get back at, oh well, I don't know, and actually asking as many questions as possible to get as much detail as possible. It's not well, what does your best look like? It's, well, what do others see? What are you thinking? How are you feeling? What are you focusing on? What might teammates be saying to you? What might they be seeing? How might you be interacting with teammates? So actually really helping those questions help that player build this really elaborate picture of success, and I remember you emphasising, you've got to, what else?
And you can come up with a range of other questions as well. If you feel that you need to go round again, or it's another session and people have experienced some of those questions before, what do you think I, as your coach, would need to see that would convince me that you were X, Y, Z? And I think with sports as well, there's such an opportunity to show as well as talk. You're not looking for sports people to be necessarily the most articulate. But if they can demonstrate this thing of themselves at their best, then they're showing that they can do it, reminding themselves what it's like, and giving you the indication as the coach as to what that would be for you as the observer.
Now, I know that one of the challenges you and your colleague had when you first sat down to write a book was that I always remember you recounting that the publisher said you've got to move from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4, from tool to tool to tool, and you guys were like, well, it doesn't really work that way. But if we were to move in a linear fashion, the next tool might be scaling, perhaps.
It would. It typically is.
Yeah. So, and scaling is something I use all the time. I used it yesterday. I'll use it tomorrow when I speak to athletes. So, talk to me about scaling.
Scaling is a natural next tool. So, it would be the third tool of this set.
Okay. Platform,
Future Perfect, Scaling. So, you might have got this rich description of what really good looks like for the individual or for the team. And you could say, well, let's suppose that's 10 on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is you're doing all these things. You're running around in a certain way, your limbs are working in a certain way, you're achieving this, that and the other consistently over a period of time or throughout a game or match. That's 10 on the scale. And 1 is the opposite. None of that's happening. Where are you now? And then we get a subjective rating of current performance in language that's more objective. We put a number on it. So we can use that number as a measure of achievement, as a measure of progress, and to indicate various points along the way of that scale. So we've established 10, that's the future perfect description, and now we've got the current number on the scale.
And let's without role playing too much here, let's imagine that I'm a sports competitor, I'm a footballer, and I've come to you and I've talked about a lack of confidence and
quite a stretch of the imagination there.
Well, yes, Paul's currently looking at my torso through the screen. I don't look like a footballer for sure. I think that's what you're suggesting there, which is very kind of you.
We're painting a picture for these.
Yeah. and it's a very accurate one. So let's say I've now I've defined what a 10 out of 10 looks like, and suddenly in my mind I'm getting a bit more excited because I can actually see what that's like, and my hormones are starting to change. I'm no longer releasing that cortisol that makes me feel stressed, and starting to release dopamine and endorphins, starting to feel better. But you want to take me to the next step here, which is getting some concrete things in place. So you take me through scaling, and you ask me where I am, and I said, well, I start to feel flat again because I'm down at 4. So I'm kind of, well, at the moment I'm 4.
Okay.
Where to now, Paul?
Well, at first you've mentioned something really important, which is the impact of having the Future Perfect conversation.
Yeah.
It is itself exciting, motivational, reminds people of things that matter to them, and gives them something of a direction to head in. But as you say, current reality, 4, not a 10.
Not a 10.
Not a 10. But we're not going to take that invitation back into problem talk, which would be tempting to go, well, how come you're not at a 10? Or more motivational perhaps, but I think equally useless. How are you going to get to 10 then?
Yeah.
Because if you knew that, you wouldn't be having the coaching. You just go and do it. So instead, we're going to ask, how come it's as high as a 4? What makes it a 4 rather than a 0, a 1, a 2 or a 3? There's something there for you to say it's a 4. What are those things that make it a 4?
I just think that short couple of sentences are so pertinent. I introduced that notion a few years ago in LA at a soccer conference. I had so many coaches who came up to me and said, I love the way, I suppose in psychology we'd call it reframing, wouldn't we? You know, it's reframing that notion of, 4, that's terrible. And we're not automatically going towards, which I know you're going to go in the direction of what 5 and 6 looks like, but that first response of, well, okay, why as high as 4? What is going well? What is strong? What is working? And just starting to help the athlete, the footballer, focus on what does work. That's such a powerful thing.
It is, because it's solidly there. And we're looking now for the evidence of how come it's as high as this number you said it is. So we're turning that subjective 4 into some objective evidence, facts. I get people to say, well, actually, I'm really suspicious of this 4. Convince me it's that high. And I'll take a very sceptical view. And people go, well, but I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And they're building up their own resource base of the things they do, the things that work. It's terrific.
I like that notion of coming across as the sceptical consultant, just to drive their thoughts onto what is working. Because I was going to ask you there, in your work, do you have much pushback there in terms of, well, it's down at 4, it's rubbish, it's hardly anything, I can't even think of anything. Actually, I'm going to go back down to 1. I mean, does that happen much?
No, it doesn't really happen at all, because you've invited people to make an absolutely free choice of the number. I have no stake in that number. I'm not going to make any judgments about that number being good, bad or not. So some coaches will go, 7, oh, that's terrific. I'll go, a 7, and take a really neutral stance towards it, and then ask people to tell me why it's a 7.
Okay.
If they were to choose to change their number, they can do that. Sometimes more spontaneously at the end of a scaling part of the conversation, they'll say, actually, I think it's a bit higher rather than a bit lower. So people tend to talk themselves up within that part of the conversation.
So as they brainstorm the things that are going well, they might think of a few more things that actually pushes them up.
That's really important, yes, because people don't think about what's going well, and they've forgotten it or paid too little attention to it, because we get really obsessed about what's not working, what's not going well, what could be even better. And that's fine and natural, but it means we miss out on some of these very sustaining resources that are keeping us at a standard that's maybe is good enough or maybe isn't, but that is already there. Solid, concrete evidence of achievement, accomplishment, skills, strengths, ways of thinking. It can be anything. We call those counters, and collecting counters is that next tool. So what counters can we collect? And we might have a counter of, well, you're at a 4 now, but was there a time in the last few weeks or the last few games, last few matches, when you were higher than that? Oh, yeah, there was. There was that period for a brief time when I was at 7. Oh, okay, what were you doing then? What was different about that? And we got more counters into our counting bag.
Yeah, so you could have a player says, well, I scored a goal a couple of weeks ago and it was a great goal, and, you know, I took on a few players and, yeah, that felt good, and smashed it into the top right-hand corner, and or you might get a cricketer who said, well, actually, I scored 50 runs a few weeks ago, or you might get a golfer who says, well, I had a good score then, and I hit some really good shots, or whatever it might be. So it's, as you say, that conversation. Open.
So there's more to learn from that good run, that good round, that good match, than people imagine. There's a general fallacy that we learn more from our mistakes and our failures than we do from our successes and our achievements. And I think it's psychologically comforting for people to think that's true. So they hold on to this as wouldn't it be great if it were true we learned a lot from our mistakes. But my feeling is that we learn from our mistakes one thing in general, which is don't do that again. And that's very useful learning. But if we want to know how to do something, knowing what we did wrong doesn't tell us what to do right, unless it's a binary choice. Mostly we need to look at what's the recipe for success. What do we do when we do it well? What do other people do when they do it well? And we learn from success and from accomplishment. And those are the recipes and the tips and the experiences and the resources that we want to dip into and bring out in coaching conversations.
It's interesting, Paul, as you're talking here, I'm thinking, I went to a conference a few months ago, and in an activity we were asked to do something similar, and I'm asking the scaling question and the strengths question all the time. So I'm engulfed in, or I'm immersed in it every single day. And yet when I was asked about my strengths and what's gone well in the last couple of days, or whatever it is I was asked, I was flummoxed. I really struggled to answer. And just a question for you, sort of slightly outside the techniques, but just in your experience, because as a psychologist, I quite like the positive psychology work. I don't necessarily use an enormous amount of it, but the Martin Seligman stuff, and it essentially bases itself on the hypothesis that human beings, from an evolutionary standpoint, have a negative brain. We tend to orientate to the negatives, and there's a reason we bookmark failure, because, as you've said, there, don't do that again, and that's almost like a survival mechanism. But it doesn't. It doesn't necessarily help us tool up for, 200,000 years ago, it was fighting against opposing tribes and stuff. So, have you found in your work, you've been doing this nigh on 2 decades and engaged in probably thousands of human beings, have you found that people tend to have a negative brain? And by that, I don't mean they're doom and gloom, it's just they orientate to the negative, and so they struggle to find the counters, the strengths, the things that are working.
Yes, I do, and that's what makes work for us, and will make sure that we're never idle. It is a problem-saturated world, no doubt, for all sorts of reasons. If you watch the news, I mentioned I started out as a journalist. News is 9/10 bad news.
Yeah, it certainly is.
And people love it. And they love drama, and they love seeing people struggle. And we're very attracted to problem conversations. The question is, where's that taking us? And if we're looking at an approach to change, doing things differently and making things different, then that doesn't contribute a great deal towards it, whereas these solution-focused tools do. So it's a practical approach to change that's used in certain circumstances. It doesn't mean I can't complain about my football team in the pub and enjoy a measured dose of misery, but doing that's not going to improve anything for the performance of the team.
Being a supporter of Watford, you won't have been doing that much of late, so...
It's not so much.
Now, so we were on scaling, and I'm just mindful of we're at a point here, because I just think this is such a good tool. But you've talked about counters as well, and that's part of the finding the counters. Why is hires for? What's working? And so, as a consultant or as a coach, you're striving to help people find counters that demonstrate they're as high as that they are as high as they are because of these things. So what then, Paul? Where to next on this scaling process?
Well, let's stay with counters as a tool for a moment, because we can look for counters in various ways. The best way is your own personal counters, which is how come you're as high as a 4, or what was it you were doing when you were a 7. Then we can maybe get some counters from the coach. So the coach might know something about how to do a particular thing better, and this is a really good moment to pass on the technical tip or the bit of advice. So I get coached at tennis with a solution-focused coach, and he will ask me what we're working on, and we'll have a go, and I'll play a bit, and then he'll say, would you like a technical tip? And by that point, I might be so frustrated about 3 out of 10 of the shots that I'll say, yeah. And you go, oh, right, well, what if you did this? And it'd be a very specific thing to do with the racket or an angle or positioning, and I'll try that. So I can incorporate learning from others into it, and a sensitive coach will put that in at the right time. We can look for counters more widely. What do other people know? There's this thing now called the World Wide Web. Don't know if you've come across that. That contains a lot of information, including some amazing videos of people doing things well, showing how skills are done. So we can get counters, instances of success from ourselves, from the people near us, or from further afield. And we want to collect as many of those as possible in order to do the next thing, which is 1 point up the scale.
And can I say there, I think, just before we get on to the 1 point up the scale, that in the world of sport, modelling, people who are out there they might be a team above you, or they might be a division above you, or they might be Lionel Messi or Carly Lloyd, or it could be somebody who's at the top. It could be somebody who is actually on your team and just does the specific thing you're talking about better than you.
Yeah, show me how you do that.
Yeah,
let's spend half an hour practicing that way to take a free kick.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we're looking at, so we're at 4 out of 10, and from what you said there, it sounds like you then start to orientate minds towards, so 5 out of 10 or 6 out of 10.
Yes. So people are getting quite excited by this conversation now of the things they've done already, things they've done well, things other people are doing well. So it's time to start thinking about what next, how am I going to improve? And people will have probably a lot of ideas, but we want to keep it in a manageable way of a small step. If people try and make big steps, they'll often be daunted about trying them at all. They'll set themselves up as, well, I didn't do it, so I failed again, particularly if they've got perfectionist tendencies. So we'd say, how would you know you were doing a little bit better? What would tell you that you've moved 1 point or even half a point up the scale? And as a coach, we're wanting to hear some experimental small steps, some things that the person or the team might try to see if they do make a difference in the direction that we want to go. Because often when people come for coaching, they're stuck. And this is about getting unstuck and starting to make progress by doing something, and for the something to be ideally well chosen that is going to result in improvement.
And so, how does that manifest itself? Is it brainstorming just small actions that people can take?
It might be. It might be simpler than that. It might be the person says, I know what I want to do now.
Okay.
And so you say, great, go and do it. Or it might be, well, let's think carefully about what we want to do now, because we're Manchester City and we're already doing a lot of things and we don't want to mess up success. I think Chelsea could have learned something from that this season of changing too much too quickly. Mm-hmm. What small thing might we try for 10 minutes in the game and see what difference that makes, whether it works in the way that we imagine it might or if it doesn't. And then we use reality in the results. This comes back to the practicality of it, of things that people can try really quickly to see if it makes a difference. We've got one other tool that we should mention at that point, which is affirming. So we might explicitly draw attention to the things that people are doing well. They've had a potentially rather rambling conversation about various things they've tried. So we might pick out, well, I'm noticing as a coach that you're very persistent, that you're very sharp at noticing the things that do work for you. You've got a great store of successful instances, and you're thinking about how you can make that more consistent. So we'd perhaps put a package of articulated compliments or affirming statements together. But we can use the affirming at any time in our conversation. It's not a tool that has to go at that point. It's just often quite a useful one to use before you ask for the small step or the small action, which is in itself a tool.
I remember how you, in a funny comedic way, but back to the course I did with you, and you were sort of alluding to the fact that certainly British people, I mean, we have a global audience on the Sports Psych Show, I'm pleased to say, but certainly British people are so shy of praise and affirming the positives. Although, would you say it's praise? Is that what you're suggesting that is, or is it a different kind of positive talk?
It's not praise, although it's often experienced as that, and so some British people are uncomfortable with it.
Yes.
Don't point out what I do well. You know, I want to beat myself up, take a cold shower, and be miserable. Well, fair enough. If that's what you want to do it.
That's the solution.
If we're looking for improvement, identifying where some improvement's taken place, identifying what you're doing well and articulating that can be useful. It's not usually the most important or prominent tool, but it does have a part to play.
Yeah. And so, back to our case study, we've got this footballer, 4 out of 10, confidence, has related to you, well, I'm 4 out of 10 because I scored a goal a couple of weeks ago. I've had some poor play recently, but I have done a couple of things. Something I did last week was really good, and the coach praised me for that, so I'm really pleased about that. And we've drawn some counters, and we're now looking at getting up to 5 out of 10. Not 8 or 9 or 10, we're now going from 4 to 5 out of 10, and what 5 out of 10 looks like, but perhaps that's I look more confident, you know, and from that there's a practical idea of actually keeping great body language. So there's a small action step there. Go out, keep great body language. That will help me feel more towards 5 out of 10. What now, Paul? Is there a do we monitor that over time? Do we come back to that? Do we try to work towards 10 out of 10? What's the next steps?
Yes, all of those to some degree. Yep. So although the conversation is about a small step, in the reality of performance, the person's going to go out and do all sorts of things.
Of course.
They're not just going to step out looking more confident. Yep. All kinds of things come along with that. In their thinking, in their interactions with teammates, in their interactions with opponents. The world's changing all the time, and we are changing with it, and we're looking for nudging things in the positive, useful directions. So we're just finding that one thing as the key to that, but that may be the thing that they do that makes a difference, or it may be something else they do that makes a difference. So try something and have an idea of what that is, and put that into practice as a deliberate, implementable small step. Walk out looking more confident. Very doable. And then notice all the things that go with it and the difference it makes. And of course we then revisit and have a conversation. And our first conversation in a follow-up session is what went well when you did these things? What's got better? And we're not so interested in did you do the step or not. It's not a goal or a target. It's a prompt for things to then happen in the next match, and then we'll talk about what was better in the next match, wherever that came from. Really doesn't matter to us whether it was through that conversation we had or through something else. We're just interested again in capitalizing on what's working. How can we identify it? How can we turn it into a recipe? How can we do more of it?
I love that sentence or question. What do you notice? So, in many respects, it sounds like this is as much a process of self-awareness as anything else. People
do get more self-aware by practicing these tools.
Yeah.
It's not the aim in and of itself, but it does seem to be useful to approach things in this way, that we need to notice what's working in order to hold on to it, in order to capitalize on it. Nature does it automatically in evolution. Nobody's noticing anything particularly, but what's working survives and what's not working drops off. And we're trying to harness those same kinds of processes in human interactions.
You mentioned earlier that you're a keen tennis player, and I know that you have had in the past tennis instruction from a coach who's very into these tools.
Yes.
What have you noticed from having that form of instruction and having somebody who's a coach who's into solution-focused brief therapy? How do you feel that helps you as a tennis player?
Oh, enormously. So I've been lucky enough to have coaching in hobbies like sports and tennis, and also coaching professionally, partly through training coaches. I get a bit of coaching during each course, albeit briefly, and I have solution-focused coaching in mastermind groups, and I love it. I mean, I know exactly what they're doing. It's not like that's a surprising question.
Yeah.
I can identify the tool that's being used, and I sometimes interrupt and say, don't ask me that, ask me this.
Right.
And even so, it's just so empowering and useful to get it. You said that you were asked what had gone well for you and that you struggled to come up with something.
Yeah.
You're not getting enough solution-focused coaching.
Clearly.
It's always good for somebody to ask us these things because it's so easy to neglect and overlook them.
It's so difficult to coach yourself, essentially, isn't it?
Yes.
And even if the coaching is just asking questions, it's not actually providing a specific solution.
No, it doesn't need to.
It's just fantastic to have somebody else ask the question and give our brain room to problem solve and brainstorm.
Yeah, I think a lot of coaching works by taking people seriously, listening to them, as well as using a specific methodology like solution-focused approach. And there's a lot going on in those things. But using the solution-focused approach seems to add a real dimension or edge. And it does stop people wasting a lot of time and getting very despondent from going into the negativity that's associated with so many problems.
In your world, you're primarily working with organisations.
Yes.
And various public sector projects and humanitarian projects.
Mm-hmm.
What are the and you'll use this as your primary framework for change, for development, for improvement. So what are the main challenges that you come up against here? So I'm just thinking within a sports setting, so many sports competitors the pushback you might get would be, just tell me what to do. Just tell me what to do. Just give me a tool. Just give me a technique. Enough with the questions already. So in your world, what kind of pushbacks can you have?
Well, exactly the same. There are two or three challenges to doing this kind of work. The first is it's a very problem-saturated world, and people enjoy and expect that analysing problems is the thing to do. And of course that's been incredibly successful for us in engineering and in the mechanistic age.
Okay. Finding
what was wrong and fixing it by identifying the cause of the problem is great if you're a car mechanic. But it doesn't work with complex adaptive systems, which includes people and their interactions. So shifting people to a different way of thinking about how the world actually works is a big, big task. Then they will say, tell me things, because that's a lot easier than having to think of things for themselves. And of course, there's a role for that. And I see nothing wrong with people wanting to be told things and being told things. But if people want to develop as athletes, sports people, and as human beings, then the big area for development is in that more sophisticated coaching approach. And if people get that, then we can start to make progress. So to do solution-focused coaching, you need a customer for change. someone who wants something to be different and is willing to do something about it. If you don't have that, you're not going to make any progress. And most people don't start in that position. It's a minority who do so, and those are the ones we get to work with. And finding them, of course, is a philosophical and marketing question as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting landscape. I think that needing a customer for change, actually historically I've found over the last decade and a half since doing your course that some of these tools can work as a remedy for skepticism, actually. Because actually the notion of talking about strengths is very powerful. And if I do have somebody, say a footballer within a team I'm working with, who's a bit sceptical about me coming up and talking about, I don't know, a specific psychological skills training technique, I've often just asked, well, tell me about you at your best. Tell me about your best game. And actually having a conversation around that. And I can't recall getting any pushback from anybody when we've delved into that world of strengths, and then elicited from that conversation just a couple of key behaviours or a couple of key words or terms or just a basic pictorial metaphor from that conversation that acts as a forerunner to say, well, hey, have you just thought about going out and doing this? So if somebody says, well, I'm alert and alive when I play at my best, well, what does that look like? What does that feel like? You're alert and alive. Have you thought of going out and training in the style of being alert and alive? Oh, wow, yeah, no, I've not thought of that. Right, well, let's look at doing that. So actually, one of the most powerful things I've found about this approach, Paul, is it actually being a barrier, knocking down the barriers to entry, essentially. I don't know if that sounds like a surprise to you, but it's I've found it's worked quite nicely that way. So I've almost felt that it's created a customer for change, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely does. I think it's a great way of going about it. I also really like the act as if concept. You've described 10. You know all about 10. Well, next game, act as if you're at 10. Let's see what happens.
Oh, hugely. And I'm saying that all the time. And I think the important thing to say there is it's not so much the fake it to make it, although, there's stuff around that. It's actually coming back or bringing the athlete back to the evidence of what they've done historically, and actually just being that to become it again, essentially.
Yes.
So I don't have a problem with somebody saying fake it to make it. I really don't. I know others do, but I actually think I remember listening to Amy Cuddy talking about from Harvard University talking about be it to become it, and when you've been it before, then that becomes a more believable thing to become again.
I completely agree, because you've got the evidence and the experience to put into doing it again. Fake it till you make it, it's okay as a catchphrase, but it's got all the implications of fake, which we don't need, because we're not faking it. We're doing it again, or doing it for the first time perhaps. There's no faking going on. So there are linguistic elements, as I think has been clear in our conversation, to how we ask questions, what words we use in the questions, and the way that we describe things. And keeping our language clear and simple is really useful for making any kind of change, and it's particularly useful for coaches, so we're not seen as some kind of mysterious sect with our own mysterious professional jargonistic language. We're talking natural language that any sports people can connect with. What is it you want? What's it like when you do well? What do you want to try next?
And that clear language is a part of alongside the toolbox, there's 6 simple principles you talk about, and just the last sort of 5 or 6 minutes here of our conversation, let's just briefly touch on those, because we have alluded to them over the past 50 minutes or so. You talk about the importance of clear and not complicated language, solutions and not being solution oriented and not problem focused.
Yes, so solutions not problems, that's engage in solution talk.
Yep.
To all the things we've been discussing, rather than problem talk, which is all the stuff we get tempted into. So the acronym of the principles is SIMPLE, SIMPLE.
Okay.
That was S for the solutions.
Yep.
L was the one for language. I is interactions. Look at what's going on between people. How would other people notice? What will you be doing different when they do this thing different in response to the thing that you do different? So that starts to address systems
and complexity, isn't it? Yeah.
Teamwork.
Yeah.
M for make use of what's there. So if we've got resources, skills and talents, let's use them. Let's get the people who are great at taking free kicks practicing being even better at free kicks, rather than looking at their weakness at heading the ball and spending too much time working on something that's not going to be that important for them. So really capitalise on the strengths, make use of what's there. P for possibilities, let's explore what is possible, look at what the aspirations are, look at what inspires us. L for language, we've talked about.
Yep.
And E, every case is different.
Okay.
So working in a certain way with a certain athlete might make a really useful difference to them. But that doesn't mean you do exactly the same thing with the next one. They might want something that's completely different and has to be customised for them. So our one-to-one work as coaches, treating that individual as individual and not coming in with a pre-formed recipe is really important. The slipper fits Cinderella only.
I love that, and you know what, Paul? It's so relevant for motor skills. You know, for movement, it is one size doesn't fit all, and the capacity. Somebody put out a tweet not long ago about who am I to tell an athlete to move in a certain way? I'm not. I don't have their nervous system. I don't have their brain, I don't have their nervous system, so who am I to tell this person what the specific solution is? That person should be empowered to find their specific solution, and I think that's an elegant way to see coaching, is it's empowering others to find their own unique solution in their given circumstances at that time.
That's a great description of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant, and talking with you over the past hour just makes me think I need to get back onto one of your courses, mate, because I need to refresh myself with regard to these tools, these techniques. They're just so good. They're so powerful and so relevant for sports. And with that in mind, how can people find you? Have you got anything coming up in terms of courses, and how can people find you?
The first place to find us is on our website, www.thesolutionsfocus.co.uk, and there's loads of free resources and information and blog posts that can be acquired there. The next step would be to get one of the books. There's 3 books that I've written or co-written. The Solutions Focus, which is the one that we've spoken mostly about. Then there's a handbook of activities called Positively Speaking, co-written with Janine Waldman. And with Janine, who's my business partner, we have more recently written, the pocketbook series, books, pocketbook size. We've written the Resilience pocketbook, which is about resilience from a solution-focused perspective. And then on the website, you'll see if there's any upcoming courses, or more likely these days, webinars.
Right, brilliant. Modern technology, mate, can't beat today.
It's good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, thank you so much for joining me, Paul. That's just refreshed my mind of all the techniques and the tools that I learnt, 14, 15 years ago now. God, time goes so quickly. And I really, really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych Show. I'm open-minded to hear all kinds of feedback, and if you do have any kind of suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I've got a great guest lined up for next week, so I'm looking forward to that episode. Bye for now.